Bojana.
So without further ado, we will begin. So if Bojana is ready, I'll give her the floor. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. Welcome, if I may say so, to our presentation and to our business integrity country agenda presentation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the time you devoted to us today. These conditions do not let us gather live, but at least we have this virtual opportunity to meet. I hope that everyone is healthy and I hope you will stay safe. I do have a few technical remarks for you. So basically, I think that we've managed to overcome all the difficulties. So those who wish to listen this gathering in English, they should choose the English channel. So I ask everyone to mute the microphone when they're not speaking. If you want to ask a question or say something, you can do it in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat and we will give you the opportunity to ask a question. This presentation will be recorded today. So if you do mind, please let us know in the chat so you can choose what you do not wish to be on the recording. So what is the motive of our gathering today? It is the fact that Transparency Serbia with the World Bank undertook the research in order to decrease corruption in the business field. Which are the reforms needed for that in order to improve the situation and in order to decrease the corruption which has an impact on the commercial field in our country. This is the first research of this sort ever undertaken in our country. In about 10 other countries, this sort of research has been already done. Transparency International conceived this research. The idea is to evaluate the status in 3 sectors that are thought to be key: public, private, and civil society together with the media. Each of these sectors is monitored separately, but also their mutual interactions. Regulatory environment is also monitored, but also the contribution that the business sector contribute in this field, but also the civil society. Our research has been founded on a few sources and facts that we were able to gather. We wanted to see all the studies that have already been done. We wanted to analyze all the anti-corruption measures in the companies. We wanted to see that transparency, and we wanted to focus on companies with the largest profits. The process of research included consultation with national consulting groups. I'm very happy to see a great number of members of this team, and I wish to thank them for their contributions and for the comments on our findings. The work on this research was launched in April and it was finished in June 2020 when the last amendments were done. Once again, I wish to thank everyone for the contribution, for everything they've done in order to make possible this research. I also wanted to thank our colleague from the Transparency International Secretariat. So I don't want to speak more because I'd really like to leave space and time for concrete informations and findings. We would like to present findings and main recommendation. We'd like to open discussion in order to see how this situation could be improved. I would like to give the floor now to Ms. Luisa Balbi, who's the principal manager in the Unit for Cooperation with Civil Society in the World Bank. Luisa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Bojana. Unfortunately, I'm not from the World Bank, but I'm from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. No worries. No worries, no worries. No, I'm pleased about that actually. But it's good because it reminds us, that we need to be a little bit more. That I need to introduce myself a little bit more. So basically, I wanted just to greet you on behalf of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is a regional development bank, and we're actually the largest investors in Serbia as well in all the countries of the Western Balkan. And I think it's important to say that maybe the bank is more known as an investment bank, and so it should be, since our core business is represented by investments in the private sector and in the public sector. That said, the EBRD is also very much engaged in technical assistance in the countries where it operates. There is a niche area where I'm working in at the EBRD, which is the capacity building of civil society. And I'm managing a good governance framework in this regard. What is the rationale behind that is simply that to support the business climate, we believe that in the role of civil society as actor of public oversight. This partnership with Transparency International dates back some years ago, actually 4 years ago, when this methodology of the business integrity country assessment was developed, and was really developed in a multi-stakeholder format, because as EBRD, as well as a representative from the private sector, government and so on, we were part of this working group that then led to this methodology. And I think that for the EBRD as such, as you know, and I will have to stress, it's not that we endorse any of the deliverable of the publications basically that we are supporting, but what is important for us was, as said by Bojana, this process. So this process, if I may, also of co-creation of the assessment. I think it's important to say that, when it's about business integrity, also being Italian, it's a no shame game, in the sense that sometimes there are rules or circumstances that can create favorable conditions, basically, for businesses to adopt, I would say, behavior that may not compliant with integrity standards. And I think that for us, at least, we don't see this support to the business integrity country assessment as a one-off exercise, but as a start. And we hope that, of course, also other representatives from the donor community may support some of the priority identified in the action plan. That said, we are supporting this effort both in Serbia and in Romania. In Romania, this has been already launched. And we're very much looking forward, basically, also to understand what will be the follow-up after this assessment. Without further ado, I would like to thank both Transparency Serbia as well as Transparency International for taking the lead in coordinating, basically, and in helping us both in both countries, both Serbia and Romania. So I would like to give the floor to Irem after that, and I wish you a fruitful conversation. I will be staying on the line, but I will turning off the video.
Thanks, Luisa, and thanks, Bojana, for the introductions. Good morning, everyone. My name is Irem Roentgen, for those who don't know me, and I am the Business Integrity Program Coordinator at Transparency International Secretariat. And I've been from the Secretariat side supporting and coordinating with TI Serbia on this Business Integrity Country Agenda BICA project. And I'm very pleased today to see, after the very hard work of our chapter TI Serbia, Transparency Serbia, following also very detailed exchanges that they have had with their key stakeholders to come to this final product of BICA assessment. And I would just like to briefly talk to you about the BICA methodology, the Business Integrity Country Agenda methodology, to those of you who are not maybe familiar with it. And in short, the BICA has two stages. The first one is assessment, which assesses certain indicators on three thematic areas based on three key stakeholders, and these being the public sector, the business sector, and the civil society. And based on the questions for each of these indicators under these areas, the assessments are conducted, as well as the underlying background analysis for those scorings. And this BICA report launched today actually demonstrates the end of that assessment phase formally, which will then carry to the second stage, which is the collective action stage, which is aiming to focus on the implementation of a reform agenda through collective action from key stakeholders, from civil society, from public and from private sector in the respective country, and in this case, Serbia. And this is why this is the case. This is a more effective way of engaging if we want to effectively and meaningfully lead to change in business environment in a given country, rather than individual stakeholders aiming to take action towards an improved business environment. And that being said, if you had a chance to skim through the BICA assessment report, the recommendations for the three key stakeholders, which were again the public sector, private sector, and civil society, those are actually those are forming the basis for the collective agenda stage of the Business Integrity Country Agenda projects and the methodology. And that will be also subsequently implemented by the respective stakeholders in their own areas in a longer, over a longer time frame through specific targeted actionable reform agendas. I would also like to add that this is a special type of a methodology because it encourages multi-stakeholder engagement and dialogue from the inception of the project through the formation of a national advisory group. In short, goes for NAG, and our chapter TI Serbia has very successfully formed one, which of course also fed into the creation of the BICA assessment report, as well as in the aftermath during the collective action stage. And again, today shows us the end of the assessment stage, and now we are looking forward to the reform agenda and collective action stages that will be implemented and coordinated through TI Serbia. And once again, I'm very happy to be here today and to see the end result of the report, and I'm looking forward to hearing the key findings and the discussion that will follow. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great upcoming holiday season also from Berlin. Thank you.
Hvala puno i Irem i Luizi na ovom našem uvodnom izlaganju. Ja bih reč dala...
Thank you very much, Irem and Luisa. I'd like to give the floor now to Nemanja, who is going to talk about key findings of this research of ours.
Thank you, Bojana. Thank you to Luisa and Irem on my part, and a special thank you to everybody who found time in this very dynamic period of the year when we are finishing our obligations, our duties, everything that we planned. Some of them were probably supposed to be done earlier, but we've had this COVID crisis, and we will see what will happen next year, because it seems that we are slowly getting used to this new situation. We've had many Zoom conferences, so we are basically anxious of attending real meetings, live meetings with people. But anyway, at the same time, it seems that we understood that we have to continue to work, to act, that the pandemic cannot stop life. or the fight against corruption. So I believe that 2021 will be a year where we will actually work much more intensively than in 2020. We will work much more actively on anti-corruption reforms. And this is something which is linked to what Irem was saying with this second stage of the project, where we are planning to, together with the partners from public authorities and from the private sector as well, to try and change certain things in laws and in practice, to amend plans for reforms and to implement plans faster. We have the plan for Chapter 23, which envisages, among other things, amendments of some regulations, laws that we have noticed require, let's say, amendments. I will now talk about findings. We will have time to discuss later on, and Zlatko will talk about recommendations. But so that you can easily follow the findings, I will open the presentation with the data that you've probably already seen, because we've sent you the entire publication. We sent it to you a couple of days ago. But anyway, for your information, I will open the table with comparative findings in Serbian and in English. And we will start with what we call the public sector in the research. And this is practically the assessment of the laws which exist in Serbia, which are important for, let's say, business integrity. There is also the assessment of the status of institutions which are supposed to implement these laws. And finally, there is the assessment of effects of how much the laws are actually implemented in practice according to certain areas. So generally speaking, before I start talking about specific items, I think that we can clearly say, based on the findings of our research, that in Serbia, there are no conditions as of now for business integrity. And when I'm telling you this, I think that we should pay attention to regulations, to laws. We should say that they're not perfect. But if we compare regulations and their quality relative to the set standards with the practice of implementation of these regulations, we can see that there is a big gap. So, while in the regulations, the average mark is around 85, I think, points compared to the maximum of 100. When we talk about the implementation or the enforcement of such regulations, the grade is around 47. Nemanja, we can't see your presentation. Have you shared it? Yes, I did it, but I will do it again. I'm sorry. Can you see it now? Yes, now it's fine. Thank you, Zlatko. So, just like I already said, we have laws which are, let's say, good, but the implementation is not good. So the main reason for this is, generally speaking, the fact that there is not enough cases of potential violations of the laws which were examined or investigated and punished. So once again, this bad result in the enforcement of the laws can partially be connected with the capacities of certain authorities which are competent for their enforcement. So they're probably understaffed, or there's not enough cooperation between different institutions. So just like you can see, the BICA survey covers several different areas. So we start with the questions of bribery of public officials and the bribery that occurs in the economy, commercial bribery. So there are, let's say, criminal acts which are defined in the criminal code for the receivers, for the takers of bribes, and for those who give bribes, and for different criminal acts that support such activities with regard to commerce. And as you can see, the grade, the assessment of the quality of such regulations is the highest possible. However, the low number of discovered and punished cases in practice means that the grade can be given, the grade of 50, around 50 can be given. So the same goes when we talk about the prohibiting of laundering of money or proceeds of crime. So as you know, until a couple of years ago, we've had serious problems also internationally when it comes to rules for the prevention of laundering of money or proceeds of crime. So our country was on the so-called gray list of the international institution monitoring the implementation of the rules for the prevention of money laundering. However, there were some improvements, and we can now see that that this issue has, let's say, more attention. Now there's a new evaluation of the situation, that the law was changed and amended, but still we feel that the implementation of these regulations is not enough, and that there is relatively few cases which were discovered, or cases in which money laundering was discovered, which are punishable based on the laws governing this area. One of the most important chapters and units that we've examined is item 1.4, prohibiting collusion. They are known as restrictive agreements in our law on the protection of competition. And here we have a situation in which there are regulations. So there's a special law for the protection of competition. There are items in the criminal code. There are articles in the law on public procurement that govern this. On the other hand, in the implementation of these regulations, there are only few cases discovered, but there is far fewer cases than there is doubts about the existence of collusion. One of the reasons why this gap between the regulations, practice, and what the research shows, why this gap is so big, is, in our assessment, the fact that there's not enough, the environment is not encouraging enough for companies actually, or for the private sector, to dispute certain cases, certain situations in which regulations governing public procedures are not being enforced, or they do not report collusion which occur between different companies, which is also punishable. When we talk about whistleblowing, we have noticed, of course, in addition to certain, or actually many good legal decisions, there are some flaws, but anyway, the enforcement of the law is a much bigger problem than in the previous categories that I talked about. So what we are missing practically is acting in accordance with those information that whistleblowers decide to share with the public, with the general public, or with the competent state authorities. What's more, there is no, let's say, there's no single monitoring system to follow the enforcement of the laws in this sector. There is available information about how many whistleblowers were given court protection, but there's no monitoring that would show if and to what extent their claims are being examined or investigated, and whether this results in a change of behavior in the public and private sectors. Also, when we talk about the legislation, which should be provided by public authorities, we are coming to a very important area, which is accounting, auditing, and disclosure, the disclosure of financial reports. We have noticed certain flaws here in the legislation, and I would especially like to thank our colleagues from the Association of Accounting and Audit who showed us certain nuances in the legislation which could have significant, let's say, effects on the practice. So the highly defined standards in these areas are implemented, but not with all companies. So this is to say that there is a lot of companies which are not obliged to follow all international standards for accounting. When it comes to audit is also limited to the largest companies, but here we have also noticed certain issues, especially when it comes to the rotation of auditors, which is a legal obligation. Beneficial ownership is a topic which is very important, not only in Serbia, but globally as well. So you can remember that there were many scandals, many affairs, and corruption, many situations where people were fired, ministers resigned, and so on, after it was discovered that they or their companies conducted business through countries which do not completely provide, let's say, public information about their operations. In Serbia, this question was somehow less important. It was less covered by the media and the public, even when there were findings that some Serbian companies or individuals were conducting business in this way. But in any case, the regulations were amended, and now there is this so-called central registry of beneficial owners, and this is being kept by the Business Registers Agency. And in this research, I mean, I would like all of you to take a look at this segment particularly. So we have noticed some concerns, some issues about this registry, mostly because the publicity of such information has been made more difficult by the final requirements for registration when you have to access data. There's not enough connections with the Business Registers Agency, and that's why we feel that the law is not, the law did not, let's say, result in the changes we were expecting. When it comes to different areas, different types of issues where we can, where there can be undue influence on the adoption of certain decisions in the public sector, we have analyzed legislation and the practice of the enforcement of legislation when it comes to the financing of political activities, implementation of regulations, and publishing information on lobbying. In this case as well, the laws are better than the practical implementation, but we have also noticed certain issues with the legislation. We have proposed concrete measures, and this will be explained by Zlatko a bit later. So concerning public procurement, generally speaking, we have an environment which gives opportunities for the implementation of fair public procurement when it comes to certain legal provisions, but not entirely. The biggest issue or the biggest concern here is the fact that a vast number of public procurement does not follow the legal provisions. It follows certain special procedures, which are entire branches of public works in infrastructure, and they are practically excluded from the implementation of this law. On the other hand, recent amendment of the law and its harmonization with the EU standards had some negative impacts as well, because thresholds were raised for public procurement, and now many public procurements performed by the public sector will be exempt from the public procurement law because the amounts are not very high. I mean, they're not very high compared to the EU standards, but they're not low at all when it comes to the Serbian situation. So 1 million dinars, everything below 1 million dinars will not be, let's say, done through a public procurement, but the opportunity will be, there will be an opportunity to have direct agreements. We have pointed out certain issues with this legislation. You can find this in the recommendations. I don't want to take any more of your time. So when it comes to the work of customs and taxes, we've seen that there are certain anti-corruption measures which are specific for these administrations that function within the Ministry of Finance. However, the problem is that there's not enough opportunity to see how much these measures are being implemented in practice. And the biggest problem for the economy is, for businesses, is the fact that it is not possible to learn or to check whether in similar situations the procedure was the same. When it comes to the private sector, don't get the wrong idea that the situation here is worse compared to the public sector. It's just that the situation here is that most standards that we're talking about, that we're examining in this research, this is not legally, let's say, obliging. So that's why in this part of the research, we've mostly been focusing on what the private sector is, what certain companies did without being legally obliged to do so. They simply acted independently at their own volition. So in this sense, we have tested mostly whether, generally speaking, within certain companies, there are certain rules which regulate the integrity in the fight against corruption. Are there any measures for integrity? And the situation is very bad. So there is very few companies that have independently adopted such rules. However, it's true that there are some cases in which the Chamber of Commerce set some rules for them to follow. When we talk about auditing and assurance and different types of controls and monitoring, the situation is such that internal control and audit and external audit is implemented, but this depends on the fact if the company, or actually depends on the area in which the company operates, if there is foreign capital in the company or not, etc. So generally speaking, there are massive differences between the business sector in the business sector between larger companies, especially those owned by global corporations, and the smaller companies, especially those without professional management, in which owners are those who manage them. Similar to that, there is also much room for improvement when it comes to the disclosure of important documents that regard companies. So I'd just like to mention that this segment 2.3 is based on the sample which consisted of companies with the largest income during the previous year. So we've chosen the 25 companies with the highest income. And probably if you took a look at the economy as a whole, the situation would be even worse. So here the situation is even worse in the civil society and media area, especially when it comes to their opportunities or capacities to contribute to business with the integrity. We have a situation in which media and the civil society are speaking about corruption, they are writing about corruption, but the focus was always, at least until now, on the public sector. In addition to that, when we talk about the media, their work, their operation, and the implementation of their role as their control role in this segment is, so to say, their role actually is burdened from two different directions. On the one hand, media are dependent from the public sector, whether through direct financing or through certain other types of connections. On the other hand, those media who do not depend so much from the authorities, they depend on the advertisers, on different companies, and therefore this topic is not so interesting for them, not so attractive to be a topic in such media. So in such a situation, we have media and the civil society which is not encouraging enough the business sector to start dealing with anti-corruption issues. They don't start initiatives that would focus on the fight against corruption. And this is something that needs to be changed. And this is the point of some of the recommendations that we've made. And we will try in the next couple of months or years to cooperate with the institutions of the public sector and with business associations and with certain companies. And we will try to change this situation. And we will try to create a society where the conditions will be more stimulating to conduct business with integrity. I will now switch off the presentation. I'm sorry if I took too much time, but I think that Zlatko can now talk about recommendations.
Thank you, Nemanja. I would just like to share my presentation with you. I'm just going to share my screen. We've made 40 recommendations regarding public, civil and private sectors. I'm not going to read them all out loud for you. I'm not going to go through all of them because they are all on our website in English and in Serbian. So you will be able to see these recommendations together with the report. In these slides, I would just like to show you a quick overview of these recommendations. More precisely, I'd like to point out a recommendation that could have wider implications than those pertaining uniquely to this report. I'm going to say why they are important for our today's issue, which is the integrity of the business sector. I'm going to talk about connections and how they can all actually be interconnected and useful for civil society and the media if they want to open this topic. If we talk about the first two recommendations, this is something that might be published at the end of each research that relates to corruption, and this is actually the question of the capacities of investigative authorities, their independence in their work, actually their independence from political influences. Furthermore, we have a few recommendations that relate, just a second so that I can show you the entire slide, which actually relate to protection of whistleblowers. I wish to point out here the monitoring of this entire field. What actually did we obtain with the law on protection of whistleblowers? If we talk about the proceedings initiated upon reports and complaints submitted by whistleblowers, their idea is not to be protected. Their idea is to indicate some phenomena that concern either corruption or other events, and they wish actually to make reports on these events, whereas the public should have the knowledge and the information about the event that the whistleblower wished to indicate. What is very interesting for me personally, and which I'd like to share with you, are the recommendation regarding the financing of political activities. On the previous slide, you were able to see the third recommendation: the law on prevention of corruption should be amended in order to prevent all sorts of so-called public officials campaigning, and not just direct misuse of public resources and public gatherings for the promotion of a political party. On the next slide, I will show you a few more recommendations regarding political activities, but I would like to say a few words with public officials campaigning. Some might ask, what's the relation between public official campaigning and the integrity of business sector? But basically, if you were able to monitor our activities from the last 12, 30 or 10 years in the field of public officials campaigning, you were able to conclude that the public officials campaigning is something that might be going on even in private sector, in companies, and not in a small number of cases. If we look at the broader context, we can emphasize allocation of resources or certain privileged treatments by various inspection or other public authorities. And you can actually see the link between these two. So public officials complaining can jeopardize the integrity of public and private companies. The promotion that will be awarded to them by public officials, if, for instance, a factory is opened or whichever event that might occur. But on the other hand, you can actually see attached strings, which are basically the influences that might have an impact on business and operations of a public company. They might even infringe some regulations in order to pay back for this service. Last year, if I'm not wrong, Dragan Markovic Palma said on the occasion of citizen problem solving, when he promised to employ some people who complained about not having their jobs, and actually Palmer promised that he would employ them, he would find the jobs for them in private companies, as if he was unable to do so in the public sector. So basically, private investors were also included in the similar way in this topic. This is the reason why we put forward this particular recommendation. If we talk about private sector, it can also be directly linked. There are some restrictive provisions of our law on the financing of political activities that actually minimize the number of companies that might give donations, but on the other hand, this might be actually regulated in the way I previously mentioned. If we talk about lobbying and the amendments to the law on lobbying, this is really important, as in these last few years, it's actually started to flourish in Serbia. And actually, the thing is the allocation of different businesses allocated on the basis of international agreements, then individual agreements, and we encounter many problems because very rarely we have the occasion to see the contracts, the agreements, all provisions pertaining thereto, the obligations of the public sector, the obligation of the private sector, which jeopardizes actually the integrity of the private sector. There are also recommendations concerning normative framework. If we talk about public procurements, Nemanja talked about practical problems, and we might even organize an entire conference on the topic. But here I would just like to give an overview of items that do not exist in the new law, but which existed previously. And these are the solution which might be good if improved, but were unfortunately deleted. And finally, speaking of the public sector, the transparency of the work of tax administration should also be mentioned, because actually the tax administration, the customs administration should be improved thanks to a few recommendations that you can see on this slide. We've performed a research and we wanted to obtain certain information about the controls, monitoring and oversight, but it was really impossible to obtain them. As far as the private sector is concerned, the business sector, I wish to point an entire block of recommendations that regard documents and programs regarding the fight against corruption. Our sample that Nemanja talked about was formed about different companies with larger profits, but we actually were able to see this occurrence with companies with international links. So in this slide, I'm showing you the ways in which this field could be improved. What could be done? Which other important stakeholder could be introduced, for instance, the Chamber of Commerce, in order to make an incentive for these programs, how to include the anti-corruption agency, how to include international financial organization, and of course the civil society. There are also some recommendations regarding the protection of whistleblowers in the business sector. This is a field that's not in the focus in Serbia, but it's not less important than this issue in the public section. So basically the awards given to whistleblowers, if they helped the protection of public or financial interests. So Transparency Serbia insisted on the awards that might be allocated to whistleblowers in both cases. I'd like to say a few more words about civil society, the civil sector, the civil society. Is something that I'd also like to talk about, and I'd just like to mention two recommendations. Civil society should cooperate with the business sector and other potential donors and build its capacities in the field of business integrity. This is really important in Serbia because we have the focus mostly on the public sector and the implementation of regulations regarding the protection of public interests. But this is another very important field, the question of integrity, of business sector integrity, and especially the question of anti-corruption processes and programs. We also think that the media should actively promote integrity in the business sector and to cover specific cases in these fields, for instance, state oversight mechanisms, types of damageable effects of corruption, collusions, and budget support should not be provided to media that do not respect professional standards. This has been recognized as a very big problem, and in relation to that, we have the last recommendation on our screens, and this is that Media and Journalists Association should draft and adhere to their own codes regarding the relations with the private sector and potential conflicts of interest. This is what Nemanja was also talking about when speaking about the findings. On the one hand, we could have very large influence of this sector to the media, but we could, on the other hand, also have the conflict of interest if we talk about advertisers and everyone who can influence the editorial practices. So this was my brief overview of our recommendations. You can see everything in much more details in the very research, and we will have time to talk and to address some items more profoundly during our discussion and debate. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now, and I would like to open the debate. You can either write your comment in the chat, That is, you can just state the topic that you wish to talk about, or if we can't see you in the chat, you can unmute your microphone and ask.
I just wanted to underline, if I wasn't clear enough in my presentation, regarding the comment from Mr. Miletic from the Chamber of Commerce. So we have in this research measured the things that should be done by the private sector and the things that are desirable to be done by the private sector. So when we talk about the public sector and the implementation of laws, every grade which is less than 100 is a failure, basically. And when it comes to the private sector in Serbia, most of the things that they have done are actually not based on any legal requirements. These were just voluntary things they have done. And this is something that should be kept in mind. So nobody is saying here that the private sector is worse than the public sector, etc. So just a slight clarification, especially for the journalists. This is just an interpretation which is important to stress. Since you have mentioned me in a way, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. So first of all, I wish to point out the remarkable importance of this research for all of the activities of all of us who are dedicated to integrity-related matters now in the association of these companies. And also, we are personally dedicated to the development of the society. And that's why this research, which was obviously very difficult to do in such a difficult time, that's why you from Transparency, I mean, we have to congratulate you. This is quite clear. Nemanja and I have a great understanding. I was part of the working group of the council that was following the work of this, the work on this research. I have given some of my conclusions, just like I said in the chat. I also have the impression that the interpretation of this research towards everybody, towards the private sector, public sector, I just like to say that the public is your advisor here. Obviously, I'm also including journalists in this, in the public, and that's why we have to be very brief. So this difference between legal obligations and when you said that the assessment for this framework, I think that your assessment is very good, because the public sector is somebody who manages, let's say, the funds of the citizens, and that's why they have a legal and moral obligations to transparently manage their organization, their operations, and their own funds. As for the private sector, the situation is changing worldwide. If you take a look at the declaration on the purpose of founding of American companies, they don't list profit as the reason for their existence, but the relationship towards the society in which they operate. This is corporate social responsibility, but this corporate responsibility is turning into standards, rules, and laws, which are called compliance laws. That's why when I'm talking about this, I have to tell you that in Serbia, there are banks who have a legal obligation to have this compliance function, and many other organizations are doing this in a very good level. Not only the major companies who have brought in these rules from their own headquarters, but there are also great domestic companies. For example, NELT, I had the opportunity to take a look at their report on sustainable development. And this is something that we in the Chamber of Commerce are working on. It's a fact that SMEs, that this part of the sector, this micro sector, they basically need support because they don't have staff, they're understaffed, they don't have the financial possibilities to introduce compliance rules. So what about Croatia? In late 2018, they have introduced the obligation, the legal requirement for all state-owned companies to have the compliance function. So the same goes for Serbia. There are great state companies here as well, or public companies which have an excellent setup in this field. For example, the railway company has a trustee for ethics, and this is also very important. So I don't see anybody here from the Agency for the Prevention of Corruption. They could tell us how many entities are developing integrity plans. I think that there's around 5,000 of them. And they could tell us how much this area has improved. In the meantime, it's a fact that the Agency for the Prevention of Corruption does many things well. Also, when you talked about lobbying in the public sector, I think that your assessment between the setup of regulations, which is quite fine, and then on the other hand, the implementation of regulations, I think that your assessment is in a way too early because there's around 10 lobbyists that have been registered. I took an exam for a lobbyist, so I know all of these people. So in the meantime, we had the elections, and there was basically no opportunity to, so to say, practically implement this new area. As for the audit, I don't know if there are any audit association representatives here, but I think that many of the big companies in Serbia who, let's say, want to have good financial reports, I'm talking about CSR, about corporate social responsibility, and all of the other things which the companies are legally obliged to include in the reports now, I can tell you that the audit is doing a very good job in Serbia. And I will just end by saying that it's now not possible to change the grades. I mean, this is clear, but I think that it's very important the way in which information is given. Let's say, I'm not trying to say that we should now, I'm trying to say that this, your research should be an encouragement. That's how I understand it. And this is an encouragement. I'd like to congratulate you once again, but I would just like to ask you to, in your activities, kind of, when you do new research about this subject, when you do a follow-up, I mean, we in the Chamber of Commerce, we are collectively raising the level of awareness about these things at the level of the region. So please take note of this. Thank you to Mr. Miletić. He's an advisor in the Chamber of Commerce of Serbia. I would just like to ask all panelists who are currently not speaking to switch off their mics. And since Mr. Miletić mentioned the plans of integrity, maybe Mariana would like to say something about this. So I'm using the opportunity to give you the floor, Mariana. I'm not sure if Mariana would like to say something, but her mic is... She would like to tell us that she was abducted by aliens. It seems that the mic is on, but we can't hear her.
Tanja, da li možeš nešto da pomogneš?
Sanja, can you maybe help Mariana?
Možda je stvar u tome da...
Maybe she needs to switch off the interpretation, or I will send her a message.
Nastavite vi, ja ću poslati poruku, pa ću reći da...
Please continue, and I will send her a message. And
rešimo ovaj tehnički problem, a kažem možda je...
So before we solve this technical issue, okay, so Mariana typed in a message in the chat, so I will have to tell you like this. I mean, as for the plans of integrity, 202 public companies have adopted the plan in the second cycle of development. So maybe you remember, Zlatko, how many public companies exist at the level of Serbia. I think that the assessment of the Fiscal Council was that there are around 700 public companies in Serbia.
Da, dobro.
Okay, so I would like to thank Mr. Miletić for his excellent comment and for mentioning some recommendations that Zlatko hasn't focused on during his presentation, which are very important, especially the recommendation that was given about the non-financial parts of the report of companies. Here we have seen the opportunity that some financial parts of the reports could be extended or broadened by having the companies list what they also did with regard to anti-corruption measures, what kind of things they did. So in the meantime, Mariana mentioned something else. She said that there is 5,000 entities which are obliged to develop integrity plans, and around 3,000 of them have already adopted such plans. So this is for the second cycle. Mariana can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that soon the third cycle of adoption of integrity plans should start, and the agency should give guidelines, basically. Am I right? Because the deadline has passed for the submission of integrity plans in the second cycle. Yes, okay. Maybe it would be good to hear, because I think that we have a representative from the Association of Accountants and Auditors. Just let me check. Did Mr. Milicevic just want to say something? Mm-hmm. Just switch on your mic, please. We can't hear you. Can you hear me now? I would just like to congratulate you on this huge effort that you've invested to come to these conclusions, which are very important. I just have one question, for example, which I think is interesting. You know that the association was against the adoption of the law on lobbying. So what is the effect of this law until now? And I would like to know how many lobbyings have been reported which weren't allowed. So do we have any idea how many contacts were established which were against the law? I would also like to say that it's very good that you are working so much on integrity matters, integrity-related matters. And I would like to know, are these integrity plans, have they contributed to a drop in corruption or to a reduction of corruption? Because my idea is that the biggest problem is that people are doing, let's say, corruption, not because they don't know it's wrong, but because they know they can get away with it. So when we talk about lobbying, I'm not sure if Predrag would like to say something, if he has any information.
from the agency right now about this, or maybe they are waiting for the submission of annual reports simply to see how many cases of lobbying there were which were reported. But I don't believe, Mr. Milicevic, that anybody can answer the question of how many contacts, let's say prohibited contacts were reported, because as far as I know, the law does not stipulate the registering of such things. And this is a problem, this is a flaw with the law, because it mostly deals with just the lobbying which will take place in accordance with the law and in accordance with the rules. But in a way, these informal contacts, it simply seems, at least in my opinion, that no special record is being kept about it. We've tried in the first couple of months of the implementation of the law, we tried to see, before the COVID crisis, we tried to see if the public authorities were taking record of people contacting them about any law, about any other general piece of legislation. And they mostly, all the ministries said that nobody contacted them. We haven't had any registered lobbyists before, but anyway, they've told us nobody contacted them, no companies contacted them. So this seems impossible, in my opinion, and I think that they just didn't keep track of this. Predrag, do you have any information about this? Yeah, very shortly. I don't have any new information, but in November there were 24 persons who were registered as lobbyists and 2 companies. As for non-registered contacts, I don't have this information, but if you need this, I can ask the sector who deals with this in our agency. I can ask them, then I can forward this information to you if such information exists. And as for the registered lobbyists, this is publicly available information, available on our website, and you can check it at any time. So, what's not publicly available here is something that they, office holders and institutions, have to keep track of. So they have to record when they had a certain contact with somebody regarding a certain matter. But the problem is that such things are not publicly visible. You have to send a request for the access to information. The agency will obviously get such reports, but for now, they are not supposed to be public. And this is something that we have proposed to be changed in the law. Yes, of course, but I'm just saying that instead of sending a request for the access to public information, maybe all of this should be published in advance. Let's say it could all be updated on a monthly level. So I would propose this to my colleagues who are covering this part in our agency. I will ask them to pay attention to this, because this is something which is of high interest to the public, especially because this is a novelty in our legal system. So I will tell this to them, and this is what I can do. Thank you. Your colleague Mariana has rejoined us. Mariana, can you speak now, or do you want to write in the chat? We still can't hear Mariana. If I may, just in the meantime, to add to what you just said, I'm talking about the contacts that wouldn't, let's say, normally take place. But anyway, these are contacts which were, let's say, in line with the law on lobbying. If we increase the number of lobbyists, so then I'm wondering if this is still a problem, or we should enable other channels to implement such contacts. Thank you, but I hope that they will accept your suggestions and that we will be able to see such information maybe even before the annual reports at the end of the year. generally speaking, I don't think that this is something that should be done just by the agency. I think that this should be done by every institution, that they should publish information about who is talking to them and who is asking certain things of them and what the outcomes were. We have proposed this directly to the parliament, but I believe that in Serbia, not many lobbyists, whether registered or not, I don't think that many lobbyists speak to the MPs. I think that they mostly speak to decision makers in the executive authorities in the government. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Milicevic, for your support to everything. Mariana tried once again. We've seen her, but we couldn't hear her. So Nemanja, you mentioned maybe some other participant. Yeah, Ms. Rada is here, I think, from the Association of Auditors and Accountants. So let's listen to Mariana first. So yeah, there's an issue with Mariana's microphone. Mariana is with Peja, I think now. That's why we hear a microphone. Ms. Stojanovic, can you hear me now? I think this is Mariana on Peja's channel. Can you hear me now? Yes, now it's okay. So I apologize. We have certain issues here in the agency with mics and cameras on our computers, so I couldn't do this from my computer. But anyway, I just wanted to add something about the information about the integrity plans. So in the second cycle, as far as I know, 202 public companies did their own integrity plans. In the third cycle, we will have the situation is such that in addition to public companies, other entities will also be included, other companies, in which were founded by the state or in which the state has a share. So I guess that this number will be higher in the third cycle. So we will kind of have a bigger number of entities who will submit the integrity plans, more companies than the last time. So that's it for the information. As for the question about the integrity plans and how much they affected the reduction of corruption, this is something that we still cannot say because this was not measured yet, and we still haven't answered this question. But we are mostly following just the realization of measures, the implementation of measures and activities, but their impact has still not been measured. But I suppose that in the future we will also do this, and we will try and measure the impact, even though this is going to be very hard. So I mean, it will be difficult to prove the connection between preventive measures and any potential reductions in corruption. This will be difficult to measure. I mean, the level of corruption is very difficult to measure anyway. So we still don't know how we can connect these two things. But anyway, we are thinking about this, and I don't want to repeat myself too much, but we will try to do something about this, and we will try to make certain measurements. At least we can try to see whether the beneficiaries of some services provided by certain institutions, how satisfied these beneficiaries are with the services provided by public institutions, let's say before and after the integrity plans were adopted. And this can be one way how we can see how integrity plans impacted the strengthening of integrity of such institutions. So that's it from me when it comes to the questions that were asked. Thank you to Mariana. I would like just to say that the transparency at the beginning of these plans of integrity, we've had a lot of support from the agency when we tried to recognize in certain examples where there were cases of corruption, to see whether such mechanisms were recognized in the integrity plans and how these entities reacted after they had cases of corruption. And I can just mention this to Mariana as a way how you can continue to do your research. Now let's hear from Ms. Stojanovic. The floor is yours. Please just switch on your mic. Yeah, the mic is on. Can you hear me? Hi, everybody. I would just like to congratulate you for your research. This is a very comprehensive study. I would just like to compliment you on the part about accounting and audit, where it is not simple to notice the right things, and you have done this very well. And when it comes to the improvement of business integrity, I would just like to point out that in the law on accounting, there are two parts that speak about the obligation to compose non-financial reports for all legal entities who have more than 500 employees. So this is an obligation for them. The law is harmonized with the EU directive on reporting and on financial reports. These two directives are, let's say, mutually complementing. And also, there are parts which talk about the obligation to compose reports on payments made to the state, to the country. So this is mandatory for all legal entities during a business year, and they're obliged to keep track of this if they paid to the country more than 100,000 euros. And these reports are, let's say, made not to control the entities who are obliged to pay this to the state, but simply to control the state and to see how they are spending such funds, because these reports allow us to see how much funds were paid to the state, and then we can see if the state has spent these funds in a meaningful way. So we can expect that in the coming period, since these reports are mandatory, they will be mandatory since starting from January 2021, we can expect that the transparency in financial reporting and the business conditions will be significantly improved. That's it from me.
Thank you very much for this. You have certainly seen in a part of the research that we try to establish how many. It's breaking. Nemanja's internet connection is not good enough. I can't hear him. We were unable to hear you. So yes, you've seen in the research that we try to establish the functioning of institutional mechanism of checking the quality of the work of auditors, primarily of auditors. This is quite a complex structure, if I may say. Sometimes the public doesn't think they have available information, available data. But from your point of view, how well does this mechanism function? The auditors actually, I have to say that actually it does function with us, because we have a chamber, and also there's Securities Commission, yes. And we will see how the Securities Commission might do that. One may say that this might not be a good link, but we will see why this has been done in this way, because it's not the most logical things to register, for instance, accountants with the auditors. It is not accounting, it is audit. So we need to see in the upcoming period how all this will function. There are bases for the implementation of control mechanisms. If we talk about providers of accounting services, there are no control mechanisms. The control is performed by audit companies, and on the other hand, we have the tax administration, which targets actually tax bases of legal persons, of value-added tax, of all sorts of taxes, property tax, etc., where we do not have a comprehensive control. The very fact that every provider is obliged to have only one employee that meets the professional requirements, this is not a sufficient condition for evaluation of these services. We do not have concrete mechanisms. We can't see regularity in the control of these providers. The National Committee, according to the law on accounting, has some authority to monitor, but the term monitoring is not sufficiently specified. What does it mean? Will someone be monitored for 3 consecutive years and someone else won't be monitored at all for 15 years? So it's not sufficiently specified and there is room for improvement. Thank you very much for this input. Does someone else wish to talk? If Alexandra is here, I would really like to hear her standpoint from the view of a cooperative lawyer. Yes, actually, I was disconnected for short. For me, this is really very difficult question because efficiencies of meeting and organizations of meetings are very complicated. I'm doing 3 things at the same time and constantly multitasking, but I agree with Mr. Militic. We used to talk together. I used to work in the public sector, and I actually think that the presentation of public sector sounds more positive than it should be. The transparency of public authority is not really high. I'll give you quite a simple example. On our own initiative, we introduced axes for coffee. I'm giving you this simple, banal example because we've noticed that quite a few products result from the black market. When we wanted to see the register of coffee producers and manufacturers, we haven't received the answer of the Ministry of Finances, who is listed on the register of coffee manufacturers. This is something that should be seen by every single citizen and not by us. Registers of manufacture of certain foods should be public for the clients, for the consumers. I'm speaking now rather as a citizen. I was talking about some professors from the law school. There are some private data on individuals and not essential data. I used to talk about Verica Barać about that. We look at health status of someone, the partner's property, We have the data, but no one has actually consulted us about the data actually that should actually be presented. So I don't really think that authorities deal with the corruption in an adequate manner, and everything is aimed to profit. I was working for 10 years on the other side, let's say, but I was never asked from any servant to do something illegal, but I was asked to pay for something that's legal. So perhaps they know that you wouldn't pay anything that's legal. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't pay for something that's legal. So there are many issues that I was unable to solve for many years, but probably this is my own problem. Basic things should not be done in this way. All judicial proceedings I was supposed to win, I lost, and the other way around. Following the rule of law, what I was supposed to lose, I won. How to explain that to my bosses who are foreigners? I can't tell them, well, you know, this is Serbia, but it's really difficult to deal with this all. In one case, our opponents were right, but they lost their cause. I really can't explain that to my bosses. Sometimes I initiate the procedure for extraordinary legal remedy, but the property directorate does not have the data on people who got the money for certain property back in the days. So I did my own research to obtain such data. Yes, of course, there are many problems of that sort and that burden the private sector and subsequently nourish the corruption. But our organization does not necessarily deals uniquely with these problems. But there are actually many problems that logically emanate from one another. What actually do you think about the situation within companies when we talk about voluntary mechanisms? Do you think that something can be improved in these cases? Yes, but basically everything, it comes from one's own initiative. Could the public help? If the media wrote about it, could something be done? If companies were motivated to adopt anti-corruption regulations, would something be improved? Our state gives subventions. It might condition these subventions by certain conditions, certain requirements that should be met. For instance, they could be giving subventions only to companies that do have regulations regarding the fight against corruption. So the same thing as we actually did in the public sector. Yes, of course, we can, for instance, amend the regulation, let's say, in agriculture, and then we actually need to respect that, but the pressure must be coerced in that way. I think that Mr. Milicic will agree with me. Private companies can't be influenced as much by other means as they could be by the state. Mr. Milicevic from the Council for the Fight Against Corruption is stating here in the chat that actually there is a report of the Council about the state public subventions in all different fields, and there's a lot of material in these documents. There are a lot of indicators about malfunctioning, if I may say, of the public institutions in that sector. Is there someone else who might suggest something or make a comment about our research, perhaps?
Samo da uključe mikrofon ako se neko javlja.
If you wish to talk, please unmute your microphone. I thought that someone from the Business Registers Agency was here. I would also like to hear their reaction if they're here, because actually we did make some recommendation regarding the Business Registers Agency. I've mentioned earlier today the question of usefulness of the register of beneficial owners. I was able to ask a similar question to the director of the administration for prevention of money laundering, and I actually wanted to find out how much it helped us identify the cases of money laundering, but unfortunately we cannot notice any changes in the register regarding concretely the register. The data should be linked to the main register of business companies, because actually all these information should be available on both sides. Mrs. Jonic from the agency said that her microphone is not working, but as far as central records are concerned, it can be easily accessed. Only the account is needed and not any signature. That's the way it is. We haven't had many problems, which is actually good, and which were actually advocated in the past. We wanted comprehensive information and data in the agency. We were unable to understand why all the data couldn't be at the same place. We have another message from the agency. No, I've read it, Mr. Militic. I apologize for taking once again the floor. I wish to add, as we're speaking about the recommendations and not about the results of the research, I think that it might be insufficiently used. If we talk about education, I primarily refer to the education of young people. One of the big four from the companies of auditors, millennials are inclined to small bribery just because of their mindset, just because of the values that they had formed through internet. This is really worrisome. And the same research says that the higher the wages, the higher the corruption. I will give you the example of the Danish bank. In the countries where there's no zero corruption, there are so many cases of corruption that the percentages cannot be measured. In Austria, the Federal Anti-Corruption Bureau has, I don't know if you can see the phone I'm showing you. Someone might see it from the internet. They have a great phone app for basically a game, Correct or Corrupt, where people aged 14 to 19 can measure their perception of corruption and learn what the corruption really is.
Alate. Naša agencija za sprečavanje korupcije između ostalog ima nagradni rad, nagradu za...
They have many other fantastic tools in the field of anti-corruption integrity. These are the tools that should be developed and implemented. Together with the Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, we are trying to make project regarding the business integrity in the Balkans region. We pointed to the importance of advertising and marketing in that field. Even before starting the realization of the research, I could see in Bosnia and Herzegovina on the local TV a fantastic commercial for anti-corruption. It was a typically Bosnian commercial filled with a typical humor. The measuring of perception before and after that we actually could conclude that they did the same thing when we did the research on lobbying. I would like to end with the example of Georgia. There is not a better example in Europe. From 133rd position, if we're talking about the corrupted countries' ratings, it went to 30th place, which is tremendous improvement. So just thanks to one systemic, devoted, dedicated approach where the leadership needs to be carried out by the public authorities, including the civil sector, can the corruption be resolved. If we compare it to the state from 2006 to 2008, when the research was done, I don't know if the situation remains the same, but this was a proof that everything is possible if we devote ourselves to it. When we talk about TVA, everyone said that it would be very, very difficult to implement it in Serbia, but apparently it was rather easy. If we talk about the law on lobbying, it will live even in Serbia.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to say something? I think that we are nearing the end of the time that was allocated for the meeting today. But anyway, as you could hear from the beginning, this is not the end. This is just the beginning of our activities and the first such research. There will be more researches in the future, but first of all, we have to improve the situation practically. And just like I already said, I think we will have a lot of opportunities to do so in 2021. We need to be ready. We need to use every situation when the public authorities are ready to open the process to amend certain legislation. Some of these changes have already been planned. The plan on the financing law on the financing of political organizations will be amended. Some other laws as well. They will start to implement new solutions in the accounting and audit area. So there are opportunities to improve things, but
we need to try and work together to have joint efforts to improve the situation, especially in this part of the enforcement of laws, where I think that, especially through certain communication between us and the private sector, I think that we need to increase the number of identified violations, the number of identified institutions, situations that should be investigated by institutions. So I think that we will start with public procurement, because this is very often singled out as the most relevant concern. And I think that even in the existing legal framework, we can really do much more and to ensure, let's say, the improvement of competition if the private sector is engaged and works more and asks the purchasing authorities to have better criteria and to let's say have better procedures. So we've seen that in many cases of public procurement, companies do not wish to apply to the tenders because, I mean, even though they could probably answer to all of the requirements. So they need to be encouraged by the public authorities, by simply to be invited and to better understand that procurements weren't rigged. Probably some companies have such doubts and they don't want to spend their time on certain public procurement procedures. So these are just some of the ideas. We will continue to communicate with all of you in the future about these concrete initiatives. If anybody didn't receive the publication with their invitation to the meeting, you can find it on our website, transparentnost.org.rs. There is a special segment there for publications. We will also print them and deliver them to all of you if you need printed copies. So if there are no further comments right now, I would like to end the meeting and I'd like to thank Nemanja. So I can now invite you. We, as the biggest producer of coffee in Serbia, we have decided that we will probably start independently to participate in coffee-related tenders in which we didn't participate before, so that you can see how complicated this procedure is. This is, and you can follow this with us, and you can see whether this is even possible. It's very difficult for us as the biggest producer to win any tenders. Okay, so this is an interesting challenge for everybody, especially for the purchasing authorities, and now we can see how they will define the conditions and criteria for such agreements. I agree. This is the best thing to do, to follow practical examples and see what's missing in the implementation of the laws, and then later on we can find a way to close these channels for corruption, potential corruption. Thank you all once again, and I hope we will meet soon, not only online, but also in real life.
Sanja, jesmo